Good afternoon, everybody. It's Tess Crawley here, clinical and forensic psychologist, director of Dr. Tess Crawley and Associates. And I am in one of my little pods in my office this afternoon, and I know it's Saturday. It's a long story about why I'm in the office on a Saturday afternoon, but we won't go into that today. I've just returned recently from a couple of days away with my family, and it's interesting, going back to spend some time with some friends in a gorgeous little country town that I love dearly, Orford, and catching up with people and finding out what's been going on up there. It's got me thinking about a couple of questions that I was actually asked recently by some professional colleagues. So I'm just posting into the Stigma Rebellion while I'm talking. Sorry, I'm not trying to be rude. And what came to my mind, what was asked of me recently was whether or not I would be able to talk about boundary violations and dual role, all the ethics to do around these technical jargony kind of terms that might not mean much to you yet. When I was away in Orford and I was remembering back to my time there, and thinking about, all the people I worked with while I was living in the community, and thinking about how sometimes it got tricky to keep boundaries clear. So some of my, I'm just trying to do two things at once here. So some of my professional colleagues who work also in rural mental health in other areas of Australia asked if I would talk about my experience of maintaining professional boundaries and what do you do when you can't maintain professional boundaries. And I thought that topic is of great interest to my professional colleagues, but while I was up there in Orford over the last couple of days, I realised, that might actually be something of interest to you guys as well, because you just might not know what all this stuff means, and you might not know what's appropriate. And sometimes these rules, these ethical rules, are there to protect, they are there, not sometimes, they are there to protect you and keep you safe and to keep your confidentiality ensured. So I just want to add this one, because there are also some provisional psychologists that I'm in contact with who might find this topic interesting. So to the two provisional psychology groups, I'm just adding this in now, because I think you might find this topic helpful too, especially if you're still studying psychology. One of the big things that psychology students are required to do is do a lot of training in professional ethics. So you might be familiar with the notion of doctors and their Hippocratic oath, which is that they should do no harm, and that is that whatever their professional decision making is, wherever their decisions are leading them. Oh, hi, Ali. Are you still in India? Are you watching Facebook Live in India? How exciting. So yes, we know that doctors have a Hippocratic oath, and that is, first do no harm, so that guides their decision making, that whatever decision they're making around your medical care, their first priority is to make sure the decision that they make is not going to cause you further harm, whether that's physical or emotional or whatever. Psychologists and other mental health professionals, but today I'm just going to talk about the Psychology Code of Ethics because that's the one that I know. I would assume that the other allied mental health professions such as social work and mental health OTs, I'm sure they have very similar codes of ethics, but I'll talk about the Psychology Code of Ethics very briefly because it can be a bit dry. Basically, we are bound by a very weighty, the document's about that thick, it's quite a weighty document, and that's our professional code of ethics, and it keeps us on track with regards to what's appropriate and what's not, because sometimes when we're asked to provide a professional service by some of you, it can be a little bit challenging to know if it's appropriate for us to do so. So one of the first things that comes to mind is, am I being asked to provide a service that's outside my area of expertise. So, for example, if I was being asked to conduct a neuropsychological assessment, I'm not a neuropsychologist. Neuropsychology is a highly specialised field of psychology, and it's to do with a lot of assessment and understanding of how the brain works and what is impacting the brain's functioning, and how people might develop some strategies around overcoming that impaired function if they can, or at least living with that impairment in a better way. So I would not accept a referral for a neuropsychological assessment because that's outside my area of expertise. Even though I was trained in some of the neuropsych tests at university, it's been a long time since I had that training. And again, I think that there are professionals out there who should be taking those referrals instead of me, because that's their special interest area. And I'm quite happy to put my hand up and say, there are areas that are outside my area of expertise, and it's fine to say that. Today we're talking about professional boundaries though. So first of all, our code of ethics says that we should not have dual roles with a client. So what that means is if somebody is referred to us and it turns out that that person is our sister-in-law or our cousin or our teacher or our next door neighbour or our friend, we're not allowed to provide a professional service to that person. So every now and then friends of mine will put their hand up and say, I'm really struggling with this. Can I come and see you to talk about this particular issue? And I have to say, look, happy to have a chat with you over coffee, but I can't see you as a psychologist. So I can't treat you or take money for your to provide you with a service, but I can, as a friend, I'm happy to have coffee with you and we can chat about what's going on for you. But that's a very different, that's keeping it in the friend zone, if you like, as opposed to taking it into the professional zone, which would be a dual role relationship. And it's unethical for us to have those dual role relationships. Boundary violations, so the stereotypical one that you see a lot of in the movies is where psychologists may have an intimate relationship, to put it delicately, with their clients. Now, clearly that is unethical. Anybody tempted to have an intimate relationship with their clients, stop it now. That is unethical. If you're a client and you feel that your psychologist is engaging in an intimate relationship with you, stop it now. It's unethical. Okay, we see it in the movies and it drives me mad, and it's always a female psychologist sleeping with a male client, and and it just, look, it does happen. I admit that there are some cases of where it has happened, but it is extremely rare, and those practitioners are very soon removed from the registration board's role of registered practitioners. So that will see you deregistered. Toot sweet. So do not go there. But where it's less obvious, there can be a lot of really tricky dual role violations, if you like, that can sometimes be justified. So this is where it becomes a grey area, and this is where it's really incumbent on the psychologist to make sure that they've sought professional advice before embarking on a therapeutic relationship with someone where the boundaries are a bit grey. So the really obvious example for me personally was when I was living in Orford, and a couple of times there were friends sometimes it was a bit of a chicken and egg scenario, really. Sometimes it was clients that I then learned were friends with my children's friends, so they might end up at birthday parties at the same time, or it might be look, I don't think I can really give clear-cut examples, but without getting a bit too skating too close to breaching any confidentiality. But in a small community, when you're the only mental health professional, and I know from my Rural Mental Health Professionals Australia page that there are a number of mental health professionals in this situation, which is why I've been asked to talk to them about it. you find yourself being either the only or one of very few mental health professionals in a rural community, an isolated community, and you might already be seeing one client, and then the client's partner wants to see you as well. And it's not couples therapy, it's two completely different issues. Now, if that was happening in my Hobart office, I would very clearly say to client 1, we will continue on with our therapy. I would say to client 2, I'd like you to see my colleague over there, because that keeps it clearly separate. Another example is if I'm seeing a client and they would like their child seen, I would say, look, I'll keep working with you, but I think it's appropriate that your child sees one of my other clinicians. Go and see Alex or Katie or one of the other clinicians and get that assistance. But when you are in a country town or a remote community or an isolated community where you're one of very few mental health professionals, it's very hard to justify saying no to a client. And that's where the ethics gets flipped on its head a little bit, and where we can then sort of flip into that first do no harm kind of mentality that the GPs understand so well. So we will have to take steps then to identify that there's a boundary violation, talk openly to the second party without breaching the confidentiality of the first party. So that's where it can get tricky. And be clear on what the nature of the relationship's going to be like in terms of protecting everybody's confidentiality, making sure that you're not talking with client 1 about client 2 and their therapy, and vice versa. There's a number of ways that we can make sure that we still perform our function ethically and engage with those clients appropriately and get those clients treated without being unethical about it. So where would we justify doing that? So I think a good example is the child of a client scenario. Is it in the child's interest for me to say, no, I can't see you, but my colleague in Hobart, an hour's drive each way, for example? Could be further. If we were talking about clients in St Helens, it's 2.5 hours drive to Launceston. So is it in the child's best interest to say, we won't see you here, but we'll disrupt your whole family so that you have to go for a few hours drive each direction so that you can get the appropriate therapy that you need? Now, it is going to become a little bit easier as the telehealth Medicare item numbers, so rebates for mental health for psychology services under Medicare, come online next month. That will make things a little bit easier to separate out some of those grey areas. But where I have had those sorts of role conflicts in the past, I've done two things. I've done my best to make it clear with myself and with the appropriate parties, what's going on and where the confidentiality sits. And also, where I am concerned, I've also checked with my professional body to make sure that I'm acting appropriately and in the best interests of the client. So it is a really tricky area, and if you're seeing a therapist and you've got another member of your family seeing the same therapist, which may well be the case if you're in a rural area, and certainly we have a number of people in that situation in rural locations. If you're concerned about that, make sure you ask questions with your psychologist or your mental health professional about how is that impacted in terms of confidentiality. What are the options if you'd rather, say you and your partner not see the same person, what are the options that are available to separate that out a little bit further? And as I said, from 1st of November, Medicare will have item numbers available for rebates for psychological services under that Better Access initiative. So when you get yourself a mental health care plan from your GP, the rules from November 1 mean that you can access 7 out of the 10 available rebates via what they call telehealth, which is what I'm doing now. It's a live platform. So we could be using Skype, we could be using Zoom, which is my preferred option, and any other form of secure telecommunications where there's a visual. You've got to be able to see the person. So that's another story. I might tell you more about that next week. So dual roles, boundaries. Keep in mind when you're talking to your GP about seeing a psychologist for yourself because your sister has seen someone and that's been really, really good. Just have in mind, am I going to the same person as my sister because my sister had a good time? Is that going to make it difficult for my therapist? So make sure you identify that when you do contact that therapist, that is the situation. And it might be okay, it might not be okay, depending on the circumstances. So it's a really important conversation to have. But when a therapist says no to you, I'm sorry, we just can't accommodate that, understand that there's an ethical imperative behind the decision that the psychologist is making, and it's in the interest of keeping you and your information safe and confidential. Right. That's it. I could see there are about 10 of you with me today, and you're all listening very quietly. I can't see any comments or questions, but I'll just quickly check on my laptop to see if there are any before I sign off today, because it is a sort of a messy, it can be a messy topic, especially when we're talking about, justifying things that might otherwise seem unethical. But sometimes when we are in a rural community, I think a really obvious example of where it's common sense to do what's right would be an example of when there's a community in crisis, where there's been a tragedy within a community, a lot of people need seeing and they need seeing now, and there's one therapist available. So that sort of thing sometimes does happen. Generally speaking, though, we do our best to keep things separate. Okay, that's it from me today. Saturday afternoon, I'm off to celebrate a special person's birthday this evening. So I hope you are having a lovely Saturday wherever you are. Let me know if you've got any questions on this topic or if you've got any concerns, and I will do my best to answer those for you. Have a great night tonight, and I'll talk to you again tomorrow. Bye-bye for now.